Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today.
Into California Proposition 4.
You got it, and this one is really stirring up some debate, I think it's safe to say.
It is.
Yeah, so this ballot measure is asking voters
To approve.
$10 billion in bonds for environmental and climate projects. And, there's some pretty strong opinions on both sides.
For sure, for sure.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to make sure that by the end, you're totally up to speed
Yeah,
on what Prop 4 is really all about, what the arguments are on both sides.
absolutely.
And most importantly, that you have all the information that you need to form your own opinion before you vote.
And this proposition really hits home,
Yeah.
It's not just some abstract policy.
Right.
It gets to the heart of how Californians are experiencing the impacts of climate change
Exactly.
and what we can do.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking wildfires, droughts, crazy heat waves, all that stuff.
Totally.
But before we get into, the arguments for and against, can we just lay the groundwork
Absolutely.
and break down exactly what Prop 4 is proposing?
For sure.
Like, what would this bond money actually be spent on?
So Prop 4 basically funds a whole bunch of different types of projects that are all related to climate resilience and environmental protection.
Okay.
And the biggest chunk of that pie is dedicated to water,
Okay.
$3.8 billion,
Wow.
which makes sense when we think about, how essential water is
Right.
and all of the different ways that climate change is impacting our water resources.
Totally. And that's something we're all dealing with
Yeah.
in California right now.
Definitely.
So what kinds of specific water projects are we talking about here?
So it includes things like improving water quality, making sure that there are reliable water supplies during droughts, and also protecting communities from floods,
Got it.
especially, with sea level rise.
Right.
We need to make sure that that we're taking the steps necessary to protect our communities.
And is all of this water stuff just sort of like blanket skate-wide, or
That's a good question.
is there any focus
Yeah.
in particular areas?
So the proposition actually has a really important stipulation that 40% of the funding has to go towards disadvantaged communities.
Oh, wow.
Because we know that access to safe drinking water is not equal across the state.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's a significant portion of the funding.
Yeah, over 1 million Californians
Yeah.
don't have access to safe drinking water.
Exactly.
So that's
It's
a really
Big deal.
a big problem.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about water.
Yes.
What about the rest of the money?
All right, so moving on, we have $1.95 billion that's earmarked for wildfire and extreme heat projects.
Okay.
So this includes things like forest management, creating fuel breaks
Yeah.
to stop the spread of wildfires,
Yeah.
and helping communities prepare for heat waves.
So important.
Yeah, super important.
Especially with,
Yeah.
the fire season getting longer and more intense every year.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've got water, we've got wildfires. What else is on the list? Then we have $1.9 billion for protecting and restoring our natural lands and parks,
Okay.
which is super important, for preserving biodiversity, protecting wildlife habitat, and just making sure that those spaces are there for future generations.
Yeah, it's not just about, preserving wilderness. It's
Mhm.
also about making those spaces
Yes.
accessible and enjoyable for people, right?
Exactly. And this funding could actually be used for things like improving park facilities,
Okay.
even supporting exhibit galleries at zoos.
With zoo exhibits,
Yeah.
that seems kind of random.
It might seem a little bit unexpected,
Yeah.
but you have to remember that this whole proposition is really about the interconnectedness of climate environment and our communities.
Okay.
And zoos, especially those with conservation programs, can play a role in educating the public
Right.
about these issues and inspiring people to take action.
So it's not just about putting animals on display.
No.
It's about the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's about raising awareness about the importance of conservation.
Got it. Okay, so we've got water, wildfires, parks.
Hmm.
What else is on the list?
All right, so next up, we have $1.2 billion allocated to protect our coastlines, bays, and oceans.
Oh,
They're facing a lot of threats right now from rising sea levels pollution.
for sure.
So that's a critical area to invest in.
Yeah, makes sense.
Then we have $850 million for clean energy projects,
Okay.
things like solar wind power.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, we have $300 million set aside for agricultural projects that promote sustainable farming practices.
All right, so it sounds like they're really trying to cover all the bases.
They're trying to be comprehensive.
Yeah, when it comes to climate and the environment.
Uh-huh.
But of course, a $10 billion price tag
Right.
is going to raise some eyebrows.
Of course.
So let's dive into the arguments.
Let's do it.
First up, why are some people saying yes on 4?
Well, the Yes campaign really hinges on the urgency of the climate crisis. California is on the front lines of climate change, and the impacts are becoming impossible to ignore.
Yeah, and we're seeing those impacts play out right now.
Exactly.
In real time.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what are supporters saying about how Prop 4 would actually address those impacts?
They argue that investing in these projects now will save money and lives in the long run.
It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Especially when we're talking about things like wildfires.
Yeah.
I mean, those images of like charred forests and
Total.
bone-dry reservoirs, they're pretty hard-hitting reminders.
Yeah, and preventing those disasters is always cheaper than dealing with the aftermath.
Right. And then there's that whole like economic impact too.
Exactly.
You read that study from the state
Yes.
that estimated that ignoring climate change could cost California $200 billion by 2050.
Wow, that's a hefty price tag for inaction.
Yeah, so it sounds like the yes side is really making the case that this is an investment that will pay off in the long run.
Yes, both in terms of like preventing future costs and also protecting people's lives and livelihoods.
And don't forget that social justice aspect too.
Oh, that's right.
We talked about how Prop 4 would direct 40% of its funding towards disadvantaged communities.
A big chunk.
Yeah, making sure that
Yeah.
those who are most vulnerable are
Absolutely.
not left behind.
It's about equity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the environment.
Right.
It's about social justice as well.
Yeah, it's all interconnected.
Okay, so who exactly are the groups
Yeah.
that are backing Prop 4?
So the coalition is incredibly diverse.
Okay.
You've got environmental groups like the Sierra Club, the Natural Resources Defense Council, labor unions like the California Labor Federation and the California Teachers Association, and even some business interests are on board.
So it's not just a bunch of like tree huggers.
No, it's a really broad coalition.
Yeah, it sounds like people are recognizing that this is a serious issue, regardless of their political leanings.
Yeah, it seems like climate change is becoming less of a partisan issue and more of just like a human issue.
A California issue.
Exactly.
And it's not just grassroots support either.
Right.
Prop 4 has racked up some serious endorsements
It has.
from some pretty big newspapers.
Yeah, major publications like the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, the LA Times.
So they're seeing this as a pretty critical investment.
They see it as essential for California's future.
Okay, so there's a lot of momentum
There is.
behind the Yes campaign, but
Yeah.
let's be fair
Let's hear the other side.
and give the other side a chance to speak.
For sure.
Why are some people saying no on 4?
So the main argument from the opposition boils down to fiscal responsibility.
Okay.
They acknowledge that climate change is a real issue, but they're worried about the state taking on more debt, especially when we already have a budget deficit.
Right, and I did read an article where Senator Brian Jones, a Republican, voiced those concerns pretty strongly.
Yeah, he's been pretty vocal about it.
He argued that California's spending is already outpacing its revenue, and that adding more bond debt will just make the problem worse.
Right. It's a valid concern.
Yeah, and it's a concern that's shared by groups like the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association.
Absolutely.
They're known for their focus on fiscal conservatism.
Yeah, they're really all about keeping taxes low and
All right.
and making sure that the government is spending money wisely.
So what specifically are they saying about Prop 4?
Well, they argue that some of the projects included in Prop 4 aren't really long-term infrastructure investments and don't warrant bond financing.
So like they're drawing a distinction between like traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges and
plus big physical structure.
yeah, and some of these other projects
Right.
that are included in Prop 4 like the farmers market infrastructure
Yeah.
or Vanpool.
They're saying those types of projects should be funded through the regular budget process
Okay.
rather than by taking on debt.
So it's not necessarily that they're opposed to the projects themselves.
Right.
It's more about how they're being financed.
Yeah, it's about the mechanism.
Got it.
And they also bring up the issue of accountability.
Okay.
They point out that California hasn't always delivered on promises made regarding bond-funded projects in the past.
Right, like those water storage projects from 2014
Exactly.
that still haven't materialized.
Yeah. It makes you wonder about the state's track record.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions about whether they can actually follow through on these big ticket initiatives.
For sure.
And it's not just, politicians and taxpayer groups that are voicing concerns.
Right.
We've also seen some pushback from certain media outlets.
Yeah, a number of publications have come out against Prop 4.
Like, who are we talking about?
So you've got the Southern California News Group,
Okay.
the East Bay Times, the San Diego Union Tribune.
So it's a pretty diverse range of publications.
It is.
And what are their main concerns?
They're mainly worried about the state's debt burden
Mm-hmm.
and whether this bond is the most effective way to address climate change.
So we've got a real clash of values here.
Yeah, for sure.
On the one hand, we have the urgency of the climate crisis
Right.
and the need to invest in solutions.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we have the concern about fiscal responsibility
Yeah.
and the state's ability to manage its debt.
It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, and it's ultimately going to be up to the voters to decide
Exactly.
how to weigh those competing priorities.
Voters have a tough decision to make.
They do.
Yeah.
And before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one more element I want to touch on.
Okay.
Campaign finance.
Mm-hmm.
When I was looking at the numbers, something really jumped out at me.
I'm curious, what did you find?
Well, the sources we have mentioned that over $11.8 million has been raised in support of Prop 4. But the opposition has reported no contributions at all.
That's a pretty stark difference.
Yeah, it's a huge disparity.
It is.
And it makes you think about how money can impact the visibility of different viewpoints.
For sure.
Right? If one side has a ton of money to spend on ads and messaging, and the other side has nothing,
Okay.
it's going to be harder for them to get their message out.
Absolutely.
So for anyone listening, as you're coming across, articles or posts about Prop 4, it's worth considering who's funding the information you're seeing.
Definitely be a critical consumer of information.
Exactly. And especially during election season.
Right.
There's a lot of information out there,
Yeah.
and it's not all created equal.
It's not.
So try to find sources that offer a balanced perspective and really think about the motivations of those who are bankrolling the campaigns.
Absolutely. Follow the money.
Right. Follow the money.
That's always a good rule of thumb.
Now, I know we're supposed to stay impartial here,
Right.
but this whole campaign finance thing got me thinking.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything that can be done to level the playing field?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And it ties into this larger conversation about the role of money in politics.
Mm-hmm.
Some people believe we need stricter campaign finance laws
Okay.
to limit contributions and spending,
Right.
while others argue that restricting political donations infringes on free speech rights.
So there's no easy answer.
There's no easy answer.
It's a complex issue.
It is.
But it highlights how important it is to be aware of these dynamics
Sure.
when we're trying to form our own opinions on something as significant as Prop 4.
Absolutely.
Speaking of understanding the different sides,
Yeah.
let's circle back to the arguments against Prop 4.
Okay.
One point that opponents keep bringing up is that some of the projects like those farmers market improvements or van pools, they don't really feel like traditional infrastructure.
Yeah.
Do they have a point?
I think it's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
And it gets us thinking about how the very definition of infrastructure is evolving, especially in the face of climate change.
Right.
Traditionally, we think of infrastructure as like roads, bridges, dams,
Right.
those big physical structures.
Yeah.
But climate change is forcing us to rethink how we live, how we get around, how we manage resources.
Right.
All of those things require infrastructure,
Great.
but it might not look like what we're used to.
So are you saying that things like farmers markets
Yeah,
could actually be considered climate infrastructure?
precisely.
Okay.
Because think about it. Farmers markets promote local food systems,
Okay.
which are more resilient to disruptions caused by climate change.
Right.
And van pools reduce our reliance on single occupancy vehicles,
Uh-huh.
which are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions.
So these types of projects,
Yeah.
well, maybe not traditional infrastructure,
Right.
are still really vital for creating a more sustainable and climate resilient future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe the question for voters is, do they see these types of projects
Yeah.
as worthy of being financed through bonds?
That's one way to frame it.
Yeah.
Another question might be, if not bonds, then
Right.
how should these projects be funded?
Should they be prioritized in the regular state budget?
Exactly.
Or are there, other more innovative financing mechanisms that California could explore?
Right.
It sounds like this whole debate around Prop 4
Yeah.
goes beyond just the individual projects themselves.
It does.
It taps into like bigger questions. about how California should approach climate action.
Absolutely.
And who should bear the cost.
Yeah, it's about values.
Right.
It's about priorities.
And ultimately, it's up to California voters
It is.
to weigh those competing priorities and decide.
Voters have the power
Yeah.
to shape the future.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly illuminating.
It has been interesting.
We've explored both sides of the argument,
Mhm.
looked at the impact of campaign finance, and even redefined what we think of as infrastructure.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Yeah,
But as you said, the ultimate decision rests with the voters.
it does.
And hopefully this conversation has
Yeah.
given our listeners the information and the different perspectives
I hope so.
that they need to make an informed choice at the ballot box.
Me too.
Before we wrap up this part of the deep dive,
Okay.
I want to leave everyone with one final thought-provoking question.
All right, hit me.
If California doesn't invest in climate action through bonds like Prop 4, what are the alternatives? And perhaps even more importantly, what are the potential costs of inaction?
That's the big question.
Yeah, and it's something that everyone needs to consider
Sure.
as they're weighing their options.
Definitely.
We'll be back to explore that question further in part 2 of this deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
So stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive on California's Proposition 4.
Glad to be back.
Before the break, we were talking about that big difference in campaign funding
Yeah.
between, supporters and opponents.
Right over 11.8 million for the yes side.
Right, and nothing reported for the no side.
The big gap.
It is. And it really makes you think about,
Mm,
how money can influence things.
absolutely.
Right, like if one side has all this money to spend on ads
Yeah.
and getting their message out,
It makes it tough for the other side to compete.
and the other side has nothing.
Right.
It's like they're almost invisible.
It can definitely create an imbalance.
So it's something for listeners to really keep in mind
Mm-hmm.
as they're trying to, sort through all the information.
Be critical of the information you're seeing.
Exactly. Because,
Think about who's behind it.
we're bombarded with so much stuff during election season.
It's overwhelming.
It is. And it's not always easy to tell
Right.
what's credible and what's not.
Absolutely.
So I guess the takeaway here is just to be really careful.
Yeah. Be discerning.
Yeah. And do your research.
And try to get information from a variety of sources.
Right. Don't just rely on one source
Exactly.
because they might have a particular agenda.
They might.
Now, I know we're supposed to stay impartial here,
Of course.
but this whole campaign finance thing got me thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that can be done to level the playing field?
That's a tough one.
Yeah. I mean, when there's such a huge difference in funding.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
And it kind of gets to the heart of, how our political system works.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think we need stricter campaign finance laws,
Okay.
to limit how much money can be contributed and spent.
Right.
But others argue that that's like infringing on free speech rights.
Yeah. It's a tricky balance.
It is.
And I don't know if there's an easy answer,
I don't think there is.
but it's definitely a conversation worth having.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's get back to the arguments against Prop 4.
Right.
One thing that opponents keep bringing up is that some of the projects just don't feel like traditional infrastructure,
Right.
like the farmers market improvements
Mm-hmm.
or the van pools.
Yeah, like where do you draw the line
Right.
between what is and isn't infrastructure?
Do they have a point?
I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And it makes us think about how the definition of infrastructure is changing,
Mm-hmm.
especially with climate change.
Okay.
Because, traditionally we think of infrastructure as like roads, bridges, dams.
Right, big physical structures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But climate change is kind of forcing us to rethink that.
In what way?
Well, because it's not just about building things anymore.
Okay.
It's also about adapting to a changing climate and making sure that our communities are resilient.
So are you saying that things like farmers markets could actually be considered climate infrastructure?
I think you could make that argument.
Okay.
Because farmers markets promote local food systems,
Right.
which are more resilient to disruptions caused by climate change.
Like droughts or extreme weather.
Exactly. And van pools reduce our reliance on single occupancy vehicles,
Mm-hmm.
which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions.
So they're kind of indirectly addressing climate change.
It's all connected.
Okay, so maybe the question for voters is, do they see these types of projects as worthy of being financed through bonds?
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
Another question might be, if not bonds, then how?
Right.
How should these projects be funded?
Should we be prioritizing them in the regular state budget?
Exactly.
Or are there, more creative ways to finance them?
That's a good question.
Yeah, because it seems like this debate around Prop 4 is about more than just the projects themselves.
It is.
It's about bigger questions
Mm-hmm.
of how California should approach climate action
Right.
and who should pay for it.
It's about values.
Exactly.
It's about priorities.
And ultimately, it's up to California voters
It is.
to weigh those competing priorities and decide.
They have a big decision to make.
They do. And hopefully our deep dive has given them the information
Yeah.
and the different perspectives.
Hopefully.
They need to make an informed choice.
That's the goal.
All right, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
one final thought-provoking question.
Get me.
If California doesn't invest in climate action through bonds like Prop 4,
Mm-hmm.
what are the alternatives
Mm.
and what are the potential costs of inaction?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is, and we'll be back to explore that question
Okay.
in the final part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into California's Proposition 4.
It's been a journey.
It has, and we've really explored
Yeah.
all the different angles here.
For sure.
The arguments for and against the campaign finance landscape,
Mm-hmm.
even how the concept of infrastructure is evolving.
Yeah. It's a complex issue
It is.
with a lot of moving parts.
And as we left off in part 2, the big question is, what if California chooses not to invest in climate action
Mm.
through bonds like Prop 4?
That's the crucial question we need to grapple with.
Yeah, because it's easy to get caught up
Yeah.
in those immediate costs
Right.
of a bond measure.
The price tag.
But what about the cost of inaction
Right.
when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, that's the thing that's often harder to quantify.
Right, and potentially much, much greater
Exactly.
in the long run.
It's like, you pay now or you pay later.
Right, and maybe pay a lot more later.
And potentially with things that are much more difficult to put a price tag on.
Exactly. Like, we're not just talking dollars and cents here.
No, we're talking about people's health.
Mhm.
The impacts of extreme heat,
Right,
air quality.
and the economy, too.
Absolutely. Disruptions from drought wildfires.
And not to mention
Yeah.
the damage to our natural environment.
Ecosystems.
Yeah, so it's not just about money.
Right.
It's about our quality of life.
Our well-being.
Yeah, and maybe even
Yeah.
our survival.
The stakes are high.
So for those who are hesitant
Yeah.
about taking on more debt through bonds,
Mm-hmm.
the question becomes, can California afford not to make these investments?
That's the question every voter has to wrestle with.
And there's no easy answer.
No, it's a judgment call.
But it's important to remember
Mm-hmm.
that Prop 4 isn't the only tool
Right.
in California's climate action toolkit.
Exactly. It's one piece of a larger puzzle.
So what else is California doing to address climate change?
Well, California has already implemented a bunch of different policies and programs aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions
Mm-hmm.
and preparing for climate impacts.
So this bond measure is kind of like
Yeah.
an additional lever.
Another tool in the toolbox.
Right. And it's also worth noting
Yeah,
that California isn't operating in a vacuum.
absolutely not.
Climate change is a global issue.
Global problem.
So what happens here in California
Yeah,
affects the whole world.
it does. And
Yeah.
California's actions or inactions send a signal to other states, other countries.
So California has an opportunity
Yeah.
to be a leader,
To show what's possible.
right? To demonstrate that it's possible
Mm-hmm.
to have a thriving economy
Yeah,
while also taking climate action seriously.
exactly. It's not an either-or situation.
It's about finding that balance.
Finding solutions that work for everyone.
And this whole debate over Prop 4,
Yeah.
it might feel very California specific,
Right.
but it really reflects these larger conversations
Yeah.
that are happening all over the world
Global conversation.
about how to balance economic growth
Mhm.
with environmental sustainability.
Right. How to prepare for a future that's already being shaped by climate change.
Exactly. And how to make sure
Yeah.
that that transition is just inequitable.
That's
For everyone.
Those are the key questions.
And they're questions that we all need to be thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of where we live.
It's a shared responsibility.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into California's Proposition 4,
It's been a good one.
it has. I want to encourage everyone listening to keep digging deeper.
Yeah. Do your research.
Read the full proposition text. Check out the supporting documentation.
Talk to people.
Yeah. Have conversations about it
Get informed.
with your friends, your family, your communities,
Make an informed decision.
because this is a complex issue.
It is.
There's no easy answers.
Not at all.
But by engaging in these conversations, and
Yeah.
considering different perspectives,
That's how we move forward.
we can work towards a more sustainable, and resilient future
For California.
for California and for the world.
Absolutely.
And don't forget to check out the show notes
Yeah.
for links to all the sources we discussed.
All the info you need.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.